Hi everybody, welcome back. I am excited about today's video. I'm going to be sharing with you 4 artistic interpretations of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Now, I really enjoy this story. So a little bit of backstory before we jump into the artists. My first encounter with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was the Walt Disney animated film, and I have to say I did not like it much when I saw it. It scared me tremendously, which says something because it's such a toned down version of the real thing. Nevertheless, I didn't really engage with it as a child, and it wasn't till I was at uni and I read it that I decided I enjoyed it quite a lot. What I'd like to do is share with you, again, 4 different artistic approaches to it. I like to do this because you get a real sense of not only the different mediums by which you can do something, but also the interpretations of a story. So as an illustrator, how do you choose to interpret a story? So I'm going to start with the original drawings that were in the published book, and those are done by John Tenniel. Originally, when Lewis Carroll wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, he actually made his own book and he did his own illustrations. But when it came time to publish the book, Sir John Tenniel was solicited to do the artwork. And the art you see in this is very much approved by Charles Dodson. He had a lot of very specific notes for Sir John Tenniel that were taken into account. So the art that you see in these really is quite close to what Charles Dodson wanted for his book, which I think is very interesting. And the artwork itself is the woodblock prints. So Tenniel did pencil artwork, and then he went in and did ink, and then it was transferred to woodblock. So it was quite a process to get to these. I think these are really intriguing. Of the 4, they are 2 of the more nightmarish ones, and for that I respect them a great deal. They truly, I think, get at some of the scariness of it. I think the art itself is a bit terrifying to look at. First of all, you have some of these totally odd creatures and the illustrations of the mock turtle story and what have you, with these pigs' heads and turtle bodies. It's just very odd and strange. But I grew up with a lot of books that had this sort of pencil drawing illustration to them. They were older books. This is, of course, the oldest of the pictures that I'm going to be showing you. But I think it's magnificent in terms of its texture and in terms of its line width and line variance. When you think about the challenges of doing something in pen and ink, or in this case in wood block, you have to utilize, you don't have color, you don't have watercolor, shadows, things like that. So you have to manifest all of that through line. And so to do that through the line variety that exists here, the shapes of things, the depth of the ink, I think is truly beautiful. There is, of course, the famous image, I think if anybody knows one of John Tenniel's art pieces for Alice, it's the Jabberwocky, which isn't in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, it's in Through the Looking Glass. But when you look at that and you look at the depth of the trees and how he obtains all of the nuances from gray to black, and the texture of the Jabberwocky's body, and then the little knight and his armor, it's actually very detailed. And I think it can be easy to quickly look at a drawing and move on, but when you actually really engage with it, you see what complexity exists there. So I really enjoy these. I think they're beautiful. They are, without question, I think they're the least interesting to a child, and I think they are probably the most nightmarish to a child. But I also think it says a lot that this is really what Lewis Carroll was after. This is what he wanted depicted, and I think it says a lot about perhaps how he viewed that story, even though he wrote it in funning for Alice Liddell. the nightmarish qualities of it, because there really is this kind of grotesqueness to some of the characters. They have very large features. The queen, the Red Queen and what have you, their faces and their features are exaggerated, and the proportions of their faces to their bodies make for something that is human but not quite. And I think that that is probably something that Lewis Carroll wanted. He wanted it to look that way, and I think that it registers very differently and very powerfully about the story because they look that way. And I will link all of these books below, by the way. The version of Alice in Wonderland, if you actually want to read it and get the John Tenniel illustrations, the one that I recommend is the Norton version, because it is just splendiferously full of all kinds of extra reading. You'll get Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, you will get Through the Looking Glass, and you get a ton. You get The Hunting of the Snark, but then you get all kinds of essays and criticism, which is up my street, so recommend. The next one is by Arthur Rackham. This book is not totally an Alice in Wonderland storybook. It is the Arthur Rackham Treasury. Now, I really enjoy Arthur Rackham's illustrations. These are the other ones that are rather nightmarish. When I was a little girl growing up, we had the A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and Arthur Rackham had illustrated that. And there weren't a lot of illustrations, and it was the sort of book where you had the text and then the plates were put into the book. I don't know if any of you know what I'm talking about, but before you could just get glorious books where all the artwork is just printed in it, you would have all of the text done on one kind of paper, and then the artwork would be printed in color on separate special paper and then put into the book throughout. So that's what I had growing up, and I remember being totally terrified in some ways by the illustrations for many of the same reasons that I was talking about with John Tenniel's artwork. That kind of grotesqueness of feature, the enlarged features, the curliness, it has a skewed, almost dolly look to some of the artwork. When you look at, for example, the Mad Tea Party, you can just see that there's a real elfish quality. Rackham did a lot with fairies and elves, and his Mad Hatter and his characters in this do have sort of an elfin look to them, but they have this, the hands are so enlarged, and they're this aged look to them, and all of the wrinkles around the eyes and the wrinkles on the face and the large nose and these sort of large ears. It's very frightening, and I think especially for a child. He also employs a lot of the textures and things like that I appreciate in John Tenniel's work. If you look at the leaves, if you look at the tree, he's utilizing a lot of texture, of line to craft something, rather than relying as much on value changes, which I think is very interesting. A lot of people think his work is very dark. It's the same criticism people levy at Rembrandt. And it's not bright. It's not bright in the same way that other artwork is, which again, children tend to not gravitate toward it because of that. But I actually think that makes for something very, very interesting. You can't rely on color necessarily to tell your story or to convey what you want to convey, so you have to lean on things like texture, like other things. And I also think that the lack of coloring here, to me, adds to the frighteningness of it. It's got a yellowing look to it, and it's creepy. It's just creepy. And one of the things that I think is interesting about it is that Alice herself she's pretty and she's delicate, and so she really, really stands out against the nightmarish quality of the other inhabitants of Wonderland. I would say, as opposed to John Tenniel's, in which Alice can kind of look quite out of proportion too. One of the things you notice in Tenniel's books is Alice's proportions are all over the place, regardless of whether she's actually shrinking or growing in the story itself. It just, the proportions don't always line up. And he was a good enough artist that he could have made it more accurate. It was a decision not to. And that's not the case here with Arthur Rackham's. But they are beautiful. And this book, quite frankly, is lovely, lovely, lovely. And I recommend it for just in general loving the artwork. But Rackham had such a pulse, I think, on how to manipulate paint and how to manipulate line together to tell that story, to preserve the nightmarishness of it, but also to, I think, convey the narrative very well. And he does. There's a lot of movement in his artwork, and it really does tell the story in an interesting way. I'm going chronologically here. So the next book is also not an Alice in Wonderland book proper. And this artwork is done by Mary Blair. This is another book that I absolutely love and totally recommend if you like to collect art books as I do, of different artists. This is called The Art and Flair of Mary Blair. And Mary Blair was one of Walt Disney's concept artists when he was doing his animated features. She worked on things like Peter Pan, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, obviously, The Three Caballeros. And she's also largely responsible for the aesthetic of the It's a Small World ride that is now in Disney World and was at the World Fair. And I think it might be at Disneyland. I've never been to Disneyland. It would have been originally at Disneyland, so I'm assuming it's still there. But it was designed originally for the big World's Fair, and Mary Blair did that as well. So this book is not any of the final artwork for the film, but what I love about it is that it is concept art. And so it's just her playing around with what should Alice look like and what should this narrative be. So opposed to all the other books that we look at where it's the final artwork, this is in rough stages and this is brainstorming. And I particularly enjoy artwork like that because I think there's a dynamic to it. I think there's just a sense of movement and possibility, and you really get to sort of get behind in the mind of the artist and see what they're thinking. It has some glorious, glorious color to it, and true to Mary Blair, pastels, which I think are so hard to work with, and ultimately respect that she does it so well. She does a lot with color, and she has her own very unique palettes, and I think it's a signature Mary Blair thing to have these unique palettes. But you will see when you look at these that she really plays around with proportion, and we move from line-based work to color-based work, to blocks of color and less detail, and where things look less old. It's much more of a shift to the childlike, to something that a child would gravitate toward. Some of the things that I really appreciate about this is how you can see how cinematically she's thinking when she's doing this, that when you look at some of her drawings, she's really looking at different angles, for example with the playing cards and whatnot, of the Red Queen and her guards, and she's thinking about what are the cinematic angles that we can use for the cards marching, or things like that, or even the colors that she uses, this very pastel Mary Blair signature color palette that she likes to work with. So I think these are beautiful for their concepts, beautiful for how she plays with them, and how it's not this final piece of artwork. And I recommend that if you've never seen the Disney film, it's worth seeing. I think it's worth really experiencing all these different versions of it. Disney was not excited to do Alice in Wonderland. He was sort of pressed into it because some of his original things that he had ever done were these combination live action animation shorts that were Alice adventures. And so everybody was always saying, well, aren't you going to do Alice in Wonderland for a full feature film? So he did. But it actually wasn't something that he had initially really wanted to do. He had felt rather pressed into it a little bit. But it remains, I think, one of the more frightening films that he did, and the combination of seeing that and then seeing Mary Blair's artwork is really an exercise in the interpretation of designing and planning a character for something that's live action. So I really like this book for that, and it also totally shows Cinderella and Peter Pan and some others. So it's a gorgeous, gorgeous book. If you like pastels in terms of the actual medium, and if you like pastels in terms of palette, if you like Mary Blair, this is definitely one to have. It's definitely one of those books that's chock full of illustrations. Sometimes you purchase an art book and there's a lot of text and not a lot of art. That's not this book. This is totally a worthy art book. Finally, my last one is another version of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, so you get the full thing. And this one is really unique. The artwork is done by Anna Bond, who has illustrated other things as well. This one is, I would say, the least nightmarish of all of the books. It has a very folk art feel to it, and if you're reading the story with little ones, this is the one that I would recommend if they're really tiny, both because the text itself is large, but also because they play with the text. They do different fonts and things like that. It's quite readable, and there's a lot of interesting interplay between the illustrations and the text itself. So you'll have some illustrations that are full page, full on illustrations, but a lot of the book are just lots of little bits of artwork throughout, which I really love. It's tremendously whimsical. You can tell she's maximized gouache to great effect, and you can see where in examples like the tea party and whatnot, where she's really toned it down. It is not frightening in the way that other things are. But I love books, and it's rare to find them, but books that do intersperse these little illustrations with the actual text. And here you can sort of see all the text, and then down. So it plays with things. It interacts with the reader in that way, and I think that that's exciting because you never quite know what you're going to get when you turn the page. It can be something a little bit different, and I think that there's an activity here, there's an activeness to the artwork that is tremendous for children, and I really do like that there's this overall folkish feel. It is toned down, it is approachable, it's cute for the most part. Certain scenes that are a bit nightmarish still retain a little bit of a frightening aspect to them, but she's made it something that is far more approachable for a child. Now there's a piece of me that's conflicted because I think it is so nightmarish, and I think this is far afield from what Lewis Carroll originally intended, and I like for children to have the feel of the nightmare of it, but at the same time you don't want to absolutely scare them to death, and this book would not do that at all. So I love this book, and I highly recommend it, and I think you can't go wrong. So there you have it. Those are 4 artistic interpretations of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will leave links to these books below. I hope you're having a wonderful day. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button below, and I will see you very soon. Bye!